We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. By honoring your career calling, you impact your family, your friends, and your community. The pursuit to serve others is yours. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donations, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel, a podcast about all things rock art. Send us your suggestions.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and I'm introducing episode 17 of the Rock Art Podcast. We're honored to have Dr. Ed Krupp, who is director of the Griffith Observatory, and he'll be talking with us about archaeoastronomy. Good evening or good morning, good afternoon to all those out in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation, and this is your Rock Art Podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network. This is episode 17 in our series regarding rock art, anthropology, and archaeology, and all things interrelated with that. We have a very, very special guest today, and we're honored to have a guest scholar of international renown. Ed Krupp is an American astronomer. He's a researcher and author and popularizer of science. He's someone who is internationally recognized for his expertise in the field of what has come to be known as archaeoastronomy, which of course is the study of how ancient cultures viewed the sky and how those views affect their cultures. He has taught, of course, at the college level as a planetarium lecturer and in a variety of documentary films. He's been with the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles as its director since 1974. And his writings have appeared in scientific papers, journals, astronomy magazines. He has a number of books out, both on astronomy and archaeoastronomy, and even a children's book. And he's a member of the American Astronomical Society and the International Astronomical Union, and has served in both organizations. And with that, I introduce Ed Krupp. Are you connected, Ed?
I am connected and obviously grateful and delighted to be with you, Alan. It's not only fun to talk with you, but the idea of being on the Archaeology Podcast Network, that is a first, and I think it's lovely.
Thank you so much, Ed. So I guess the way we open this up often with someone of your background is, how in the world did you ever get involved in the field of astronomy? When did you first sort of have an inkling that that might be the direction of your passions?
You know, a lot of astronomers are probably pretty insufferable, at least those of a certain age, and I am of that certain age, where we were kids. I was born in 1944, and I remember very clearly that development and direction. I was about 8 years old and interested, as kids are, in just about everything from dinosaurs to lizards to whatever, to astronomy, everything that was around there. And I was given a book by my parents. I think they must have purchased it from some door-to-door salesperson or whatever. And the book was an illustrated kids book about astronomy, but it was a very curious mixture of mythology and astronomy, about a little kid who not only went to the planets, but encountered at those planets the Greek or Roman god after whom the planet was named. And so the book had a kind of a storyline to it. And whatever it was, that simply captured me. And I did decide to become an astronomer because of that book, and did not shift from that course. And just as a quick aside, I'd kind of like to document something that I found very strange and yet interesting about that process, which was certainly personal to me. But I was in an American Astronomical Society meeting decades and decades ago when I was still an astronomy graduate student. And whoever was giving this talk to the whole assembly of American astronomers, and in those days, just about all of them would show up at a meeting. So there were maybe a couple of thousand people or so attending. And the speaker asked, how many of you decided to become an astronomer as a young person? And just about everybody in the room raised his or her hand. And then the second question was, how many of you decided to become an astronomer because of either a visit to a planetarium, a view through a telescope, or a book? And again, the whole room raised hands. And I thought at the time, well, that's how you make astronomers. It's that simple. Yeah, so the recipe was clear. I think things have gotten much richer and more complex today. There are a lot more opportunities for astronomers. But back then, when the vision was you would go off to some mountaintop observatory and be a hermit on behalf of the stars, that's kind of how I thought of it.
Well, that's amazing. So as a child, you had a book. You became focused on astronomy, but also the interface between astronomy and how the cosmos is depicted or perceived, and how that relates to a society's sacred narrative, culture, religion. Am I on track?
You really are. With the only departure, I would say, is particularly growing up. And I think even in that era, most people weren't even thinking with such well-defined understanding of those subjects as you've just expressed. And I think that's partly a result of evolution of the thinking and of course the work in this area that so many people have undertaken over the last several decades. But you're exactly right. Although if you were to have asked me at the time, say as a high school student, or even, while in college, well, are you really interested in the cultural interface of astronomy? And I probably would have shaken my head and said, I just don't know what you're talking about. But in fact, you do pay attention to all those things. There's a romance and a wonder to that aspect of the human element in the reaching for the sky. And I think that's behind the inquiries of lots of astronomers. They're very much focused on the modern astrophysical research, and yet for many of them, the history and the cultural background of it is a part of what you grow up with.
So where did you end up developing this particular expertise? Where did you go to school, your undergraduate and your graduate activities, perhaps?
Yeah, I probably really owe both of those places to a lot of whatever idiosyncratic worldview I entertain. I went as an undergraduate to Pomona College in Claremont, California. It's a small liberal arts college that had a very solid, still does, science departments, and went there to major as a physics major and an astronomy major, and got to live in the on-campus observatory for 2 years. I was the weatherman and the local astronomer taking care of the observatory. And after Pomona, I went to UCLA, Department of Astronomy, of course, graduate school, which is a whole different kind of environment, both with respect to the scale of a major university, but also, as you well know, graduate school is a different kind and a very focused enterprise. But in both of those cases, I really do owe everything to my advisors at each of those institutions, Dr. Bob Chambers at Pomona College and Dr. George Abel at UCLA. They were the people who, throughout that, continued to encourage and guide and also not get too upset when I would do something really off the wall.
So, speaking of something off the wall, what was one of perhaps more interesting experiences you had in the journey toward an understanding of the world of astronomy?
It was really pretty quiet through much of that period, but to sort of show a more serious and even structured element of this, when I was in grad school at UCLA, I became acquainted through George Abel, but other senior astronomers and even retired astronomers and such around Los Angeles, a community that is very, very rich in astronomical heritage and history. I mean, the modern universe was discovered right here in Southern California, up at Mount Wilson, which is doing all it can to stay out of the flames this particular summer. But the fact is, a number of those astronomers had simply decided, just for fun, that they would start a society for the history of astronomy of Los Angeles. It was called that, the Los Angeles Society for the History of Astronomy. They would just meet about once a month, and these were informal meetings. There was nothing really high-powered about this. The group of people just decided, well, I'll show up, maybe 30 of them or so, would volunteer one or another from month to month to do some kind of a presentation which would precipitate conversation and debates and such. And the importance of that was through that process and listening to people who had quite varied interest and, of course, extensive experience. I was exposed to all kinds of aspects of astronomy, particularly, of course, history, because that's what it was all about, but how that history, in fact, had an impact on the course of the way modern astronomy research was conducted. And so that really did actually alter my perspective, where I wound up being a little more systematic, a little more thoughtful, a little less dilettantish about history. Still a dilettante, but I kind of respected the people who actually did such things as history.
So in this regard, one of the revelations that you're sharing is that there is a history to the study of astronomy that is rather important and located, centered in our own backyard in Los Angeles. Is that correct?
It really is true. I mean, if you look at the history of astronomy from the broad perspective, I mean, obviously you could imagine going back to the Upper Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, where we, of course, don't have any written records or anything, but there are elements from those times that have been speculated to have astronomical significance. But by the time you get to the point where people are writing things down, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and then on through, of course, Greece and Rome, but not to mention on other sides of the earth, China and in India as well. Each of these places is developing an astronomical expertise, and because written language is also on hand by the time you've got such settlements taking place with cities and the political and social organizations growing more complex, not quite like they are today, but headed in that direction, you can see that the search for information from the sky, the systematic collection of it, and the use that people put to it is at least in part documented, and that tradition of observing the sky and then trying to understand what in the world it's doing and why is it doing it just keeps on going right through history. And it's a story that we tell ourselves, of course, still today about the great developments of astronomy, often in terms of great personalities like Copernicus, Kepler, and Isaac Newton, or Edmund Halley, and so on. But your point about Southern California and its role in this is really kind of stunning. Southern California, well, maybe we should expand it and just give the whole state, because Lick Observatory up by Berkeley and San Francisco is a very important element of California astronomy and a pioneer of that too. So think of California really as the Alexandria of modern astronomy at the beginning or so of the 20th century. And a tremendous number of pioneering initiatives were undertaken in this area. Mountaintop observatories, getting serious about astrophysics. And so not just observing what the objects in the sky seem to be doing, but trying to understand physically why they do what they do. These are things that are really part, not exclusively a California heritage, but California was really out in front of all this. And then, of course, here in Southern California, up at Mount Wilson, you have Edwin Hubble taking advantage of observations of distant galaxies, and from their motions and from their distances, discovering something absolutely extraordinary, that the universe is expanding. We kind of take that for granted today. It's sort of a cliche. It's the kind of thing that you kind of know and you hear about. But had any of us been around in the 19th century, that particular notion would have seemed utterly alien, as it would have as we penetrate back in time as far as we can and examine people's cosmological sensibilities. People have not thought of the universe as changing dramatically over time on that grand scale. And of course, that is what came out of Mount Wilson and Edwin Hubble right here overlooking Los Angeles.
So it sounds like that certainly here in California and with Edwin Hubble and certainly with others, we were on the cutting edge of discovery with respect to observing the sky and understanding our universe.
No question that is true. And in fact, now the cutting edge is, of course, worldwide. But California tentacles extend everywhere, with observatories located in the Southern Hemisphere and elsewhere, and collaboration, of course, across the continents. But also the role that California has played in space exploration is key to all of this as well, transforming human perspective. The race to the moon very much in part centered in California. Not all of it, of course. There was a great deal. The whole country was involved. But Southern California was a location of central importance for the development of those rockets and, of course, the actual technology that took us really on a watershed event in the history of the planet. The first time organisms left the surface of the earth and landed on another world. And that happened, within my lifetime. It's one thing to say people went to the moon. It's another thing to say that's the first time that ever happened on this planet. It is, on an evolutionary perspective, really something kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's very extraordinary. Well, since we're on the Archaeology podcast network, and this is on Rock Art as well, I guess there's a field that you, in fact, are one of the grand masters of and the pioneers of it. And I know it's sort of a connection between archaeology and astronomy. And as a sort of a segue to the next segment, maybe give us a teaser as to how you think about that field or why it interested you.
The notion of archaeoastronomy, which existed before there was such a word, really came, I think, to prominence in the 1960s with Gerald Hawkins, a British-born but American naturalized astronomer who got interested in Stonehenge and alignments between various features of that prehistoric monument. And he wound up proposing a notion that Stonehenge has astronomical alignments that turned it into an observatory, and also elements that made it into a kind of an astronomical computer. Those claims and his papers and books, and then ultimately television show on that notion, really lit a fire. And out of that fire of high public interest, there was also a small group of people, unknown to each other, who just thought, maybe I could do some of that too. Let me go look into that.
I think that's a great place to stop for this segment. And in the next segment, we'll get into what is archaeoastronomy and why is it so interesting. See you on the flip-flop.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ROCKART. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
Well, welcome back. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and we are blessed to have Ed Krupp, director of the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, California. He's here as our guest scholar to speak about his role in astronomy, and specifically in this segment, the second segment of our 3-segment sort of tour de force here, on the field of archaeoastronomy. Ed, take it away.
Thanks, Alan. Archaeoastronomy didn't always exist, either as an area of inquiry or, for that matter, as a word. And it really is a word with too many vowels. Anybody tries to spell that word, they run into trouble. But people kind of want to know what it is. And that goes back to the time when Gerald Hawkins wrote his Stonehenge Decoded book, in which he interpreted this prehistoric monument everybody knows in southern England that is part of the New Stone Age and the Bronze Age of Britain. And he proposed that it had astronomical alignments built in deliberately between various arches and stones that were intended to help the people that built it establish important astronomical events, the key turning times of the seasons being primary. But he also thought there was an interest in the moon there and other details. And he called that, at the time, astroarchaeology. There was no archaeoastronomy then. It was just another word with also too many vowels and kind of hard to say. But that term was around for a while, and it seemed to relate to the idea of looking at alignments in ancient monuments. But as time went on, there wasn't a lot of other activity. Hawkins went off to other parts of the world to look at antiquities that had caught his attention, Egyptian temples and the famed lines of Nazca in Peru, which at that time hardly anybody had ever heard of, and a few other places. And he tried in a second book to show this as a kind of a worldwide phenomenon. But again, he was very much out there by himself. He was following the footsteps of Sir Norman Lockyer, who almost 3/4 of a century earlier had similar inclinations about astronomical alignments, and they had kind of ended with Lockyer. He was a famous astronomer who discovered helium in the sun, but he also had this other side of his interest. So things were kind of left that way with Gerald Hawkins and his books. But those books had caught the attention of a few other people, and I was certainly one of them. And by the time I got to Griffith Observatory as a graduate student still, but having a part-time job as a planetarium lecturer, before I knew it, we were developing, and I was therefore rehearsing, the presentation of a show called The Dawn of Astronomy, which was about all this stuff. It was about Stonehenge and Egyptian temples. And so that begins to sort of slip into your consciousness, at least mine, where you kind of know these things are around there, but I wasn't paying very much attention to it until by chance I got one of these book catalogs from Blackwell's, famous dealer of books in Oxford, England. And I was buying all kinds of books, and I happened to page through the catalog and found this book, Megalithic Lunar Observatories. And I thought, that is really strange. I knew what megalithic meant, big stones. I knew what lunar meant, that's about the moon. And I certainly knew what observatories were, but I had no idea how all this fit together. I thought I should send off and write for this book and buy it and take a look at it. Well, the book came, and I was kind of astonished. It was by Professor Alexander Thom, extremely technical. The technical details no longer really matter, however. What was really extraordinary is that Alexander Thom, a retired engineer in Scotland, had personally surveyed hundreds of these prehistoric monuments in Britain. And I didn't even know there were prehistoric monuments all over the place in Britain, let alone 300. And those are just the ones that are left. So at about that time, I also had the opportunity for my first full-time job, which was here at Griffith Observatory. And I realized that if I kept working for another year, I would have a vacation coming, a 2-week paid vacation. And I thought, I should go over to Britain and have a look at these stone monuments that sound so weird. And so that's exactly what I did. And I wound up actually corresponding with Professor Thom and his son. And as time went on, that led to one trip after another. And I came back, which was wonderful in those days. I mean, this is like the 1970s. And you could go and take a trip for 2 or 3 weeks to England and come back an expert, on these things. That was just a marvel. So just by going, I mean, it's that silly. So I came back, and I was interested in this stuff. And UCLA Extension got in touch with me and said, "Don't you think it'd be a good idea if we did some kind of a course on this?" And it should be a great idea. I wonder where in the world we're going to get anybody or any material. I don't know anything more than where I just went, and that's it. But in fact, little stories had begun to emerge. People like Tony Aveni working in Mesoamerica, Jack Eddy working on the medicine circles, medicine wheels, really in the Great Basin on the flank of the Sierras, Rocky Mountains, and other folks, the Toms, of course, in Britain. And so I put together a course for UCLA Extension at UCLA and UC San Diego, and we brought these folks in 1 week after another for about 7 weeks, each one doing a lecture on the topic. And that was sort of my first realization that there was actually anybody out there with any kind of serious interest in this and pursuing that. And out of that coursework, I was able to persuade the other participants to contribute a chapter to a book. And so the first book that I did, In Search of Ancient Astronomies, was really the assembly of chapters that I had written and then chapters from each of these other contributors. And it kind of just went on from that point where you realize, and it's a lot by happenstance, but you realize somebody knows somebody, and that somebody is doing something. And in time, I came to understand that there was more than just a handful, but maybe 2 or 3 dozen people out and around examining independently monuments in the American Southwest, rock art in California, things going on in Mesoamerica and in Peru. There were areas of the world that weren't being examined very carefully, like Egypt and China. And it just was probably harder to do that. Nobody at the time was doing that. But it was through that process that I became acquainted with yet one more person. And the next thing you know, somebody's organizing a conference and something else is taking place. And gradually, this relatively small community of people starts growing and sharing the work that they're doing and the interests. And the really interesting thing about this group of people is they aren't all a bunch of astronomers, which would have been both boring and probably uninformative. But you had astronomers, you had architects, you had art historians, you had archaeologists, you had anthropologists, people who were interested in the history of religion. They're kind of all over the map. People were bringing specialties to these questions of ancient monuments or ancient expressions that they thought might have some connection to the sky. And it became a genuinely multidisciplinary inquiry. And that's really what archaeoastronomy is. It is first and foremost a multidisciplinary inquiry, which requires expertise from many different disciplines, and it requires a kind of a collaboration between those disciplines, because each of them in their own way are focused more narrowly than a cross-disciplinary conversation would be. And then also, as time went on, this material evolved from kind of looking at alignments in buildings and other sorts of monumental architecture and some examination of symbols. But people gradually realized that what they were looking at was the relationship between culture and the sky. What is it that people get from the sky? What do they use it for? And how do they use it? How is it expressed? And of course, from one culture to another, things vary tremendously. There are some important factors that affect the way that people look at the sky and what they take from it. And some of the factors are just sort of matters of chance. But just to pull one out of the air, for example, in ancient Egypt, the star Sirius was the big deal. Now, Sirius is a brilliant star. It's the brightest star in the sky, of course, and lots of people notice it. But the Egyptians had the curious fortune to have the reappearance of the star Sirius in the dawn sky, in the morning sky, after it had disappeared for 70 days, just because of the orbital motion of the Earth. So it appears as though Sirius is too close to the sun to be seen, and then it pops out again for a moment in the morning sky. That particular astronomical event coincided roughly with the inundation of the Nile Valley. Well, that's what made Egypt. Without the Nile and the annual inundation, you would not have the breadbasket of the Mediterranean in Roman times. It was an incredibly fertile area because of this runoff, this winter runoff from Ethiopia and Eastern Africa, coming down the Nile rivers, the two main branches, and converging in Sudan at Khartoum, and then heading north up to the Mediterranean, and doing that as a seasonal event. And that's really one of the keys. People are watching the things that make a difference to them. And they're very economical, actually, and seasonal change is absolutely key because it affects the need for shelter, clothing, and, of course, the availability of food. And seasonal change is also very closely related to human mortality. There are times of the year that are rough, depending on where you happen to live. And so people do pay attention to those things, and they look for clues wherever they can find them, and some of those clues were found in the sky.
So it is the coincidence of certain key astronomical elements that are identified and their manifestation in the sky and at various locations on the horizon, and correlating those with very important economic or cultural activities. Am I correct?
Absolutely correct. And then what happens, of course, is because they're important and because they're correlated with things that people care about, that sky stuff gets expressed in almost everything. It gets expressed in art. It gets expressed in political structure. It gets expressed, of course, in kinship groups and religion, obviously, because those are the things that define our lives and organize our lives for us. And the sky simply is playing an obvious and key and helpful role.
So from my limited knowledge, I guess, of archaeoastronomy and my experience in the grand golden state of California, I understand that native people, indigenous people, hunters and gatherers, and even agriculturalists to some extent, saw that the sun and its movements were timed to certain key elements within their culture. And I think it was the solstice and the equinox that became critically important for them. Why is that?
First, you're absolutely right. And the solstices are phenomenally important because they are so obvious and so linked to seasonal change. The two solstices, summer in June, this is for the Northern Hemisphere, and winter in December, mark, of course, times of the year that are very different, just in terms of the weather that people are encountering and also the availability of the resources wherever they happen to be. But on top of that, what you have is a migration of the sun back and forth from north to south along the horizon when it's rising and when it's setting over the course of the year like that. So people, they tune into this kind of thing almost second nature. They're looking for what things are connected to what. And people realize, I mean, this must go back to the old Stone Age at least, where people recognize that there are times of the year when you see the sun come up way over there, and there are other times 6 months later, which you might figure out by just counting phases of the moon, cycles of the moon, and you say, well, it's roughly 6 of those, and we find that the sun is down there on that other side of the horizon in the south, and it goes back and forth and seems to be coordinated with what's going on the earth. And those are things that are relatively easy to observe systematically. And in fact, that's exactly what people do and did. And the remarkable thing, I think, is not so much agriculturalists. People who are agriculturalists are settled on the land. They're often in more structured societies, and there may or may not be, but often is a writing system in place, at least eventually. And so the idea of keeping track of the annual migration back and forth, north to south and back again of the sun is a relatively straightforward enterprise. It only takes 2 things, a place to stand and a place to look. And well, the third thing you need is a designated authority. Everybody can see this, but you need somebody to say, I'm the one who's observing it, and so I'm coordinating us as a group. And that is what people do. I think the remarkable discovery that and if you could even call it a discovery, the realization that occurred when people were examining this archaeoastronomy stuff in the 70s was the fact that there are hunter and gathering people that know this stuff too and did the same thing. And prior to that time, I think people who were hunters and gatherers were just not thought of as part of the mix, which is foolishness. I mean, they are as dependent on the resources of the planet as anybody else. They're aware of seasonal change, and that seasonal change governs their lives. And so out of that kind of understanding, particularly, I think, the California anthropologists and archaeologists made a big difference. People like Travis Hudson and John Romani and Ken Hedges, but others as well, who took on this business of California astronomy, a lot of it buried in the notes of pioneering ethnographer John Peabody Harrington, ran around the country for the Smithsonian, just taking down notes as fast as he could before cultures evaporated and languages disappeared. And by going back to that remarkable reserve of data from Harrington and other people, individuals like Travis Hudson, especially a pioneer, worked through that material and found that there was a lot of astronomy in that material, and you could pull it out and kind of organize it and see what people were up to.
All right. Well, while Alan finds his internet connection, let's call that the end of segment 2, and we'll come back and wrap up this interview in segment 3. Back in a second. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
Well, hello out there in Archaeology podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, on your Rock Art podcast. And this is the third and final segment in our interview with Ed Krupp, director of the Griffith Observatory. Ed, are you there?
I am.
Ed, it's a pleasure, and I think we've had a wondrous journey talking about astronomy and the field of archaeoastronomy. And in this final segment, what would you say is one of the more interesting case studies or the experiences you've had in perhaps doing your own research and investigating a particular aspect of this field?
You know, Alan, you can go all around the world because I've gotten to do work in China and in Egypt and in Europe as well, and a few things even in Mesoamerica and such. But I think one of the most amusing connections for me is really California rock art and, of course, California Indians. And the fact is, when I did my very first book on ancient and prehistoric astronomy. That was published in 1978. I didn't know that there was such a thing as California Indian rock art. I didn't even know anything about California Indian. And that is truly an abysmal ignorance as things turned out, because the material and the people so rich. I had my head turned the right way, actually, by the late Travis Hudson and his collaborator, Ernie Underhay, who after my first book came out, called me and said, hey, we've got this book on Chumash astronomy, and we kind of like to talk to you and get acquainted and have you see kind of what we've been looking at. And of course, first I was delighted with the contact and happy to meet Travis and Ernie, but I really didn't have a clue as to what they were talking about. The Chumash were just a mystery. I had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. But Travis came along and I read his book and started paying attention and realizing where the data come from, and that, in fact, there's some remarkable things to be known, not the least of which is the extraordinary reservoir of rock art in California, one of the great geographic centers of rock art. And I had to, of course, start paying attention to what people say about it, and because I just didn't have a clue. So that was an introduction, at least to the complexity and the richness of the material. But as you would probably know, a lot of this kind of thing, it's not what you know that counts, and it's not who you know that counts. It's what who you know knows that counts. And so I would start running into people, meeting people who would know things that I realized were of interest and valuable to me. And among those people were John Romani and Gwen Romani and Dan Larson, who had their own archaeological company in the San Fernando Valley. And they had connections with the Santa Susana Field Laboratory that was operated at that time, when we're talking about the late 1970s, very end of the 1970s, operated then by Rocketdyne. And the Santa Susana Field Laboratory was a place where all kinds of technological stuff went on, including the testing of rockets. That was, in fact, the place where the rocket engines that took us to the moon were tested. And I remember as a kid living in Woodland Hills and in Reseda in the San Fernando Valley here in Los Angeles, and you would hear periodically this incredible roar coming out of the northwest corner of the valley. You could see the mountains there glowing because of these rocket engines being tested. So John and Dan and Gwen invited me. First, they invited me to a different site, also local, where they thought there might be some astronomy. We went out there at the summer solstice, and it was a bust. And it was sort of now, I wouldn't say the first introduction to Chumash rock art. That came with Travis. But this was a case of, okay, here's another site, and they had some ideas, and nothing kind of came of it. But those guys were terrors. They were on to stuff, and they were not going to ever quit on anything. And they had connections up at the field laboratory. The chief fire engineer, a guy named Fred Couture, who could get us onto the field laboratory, particularly on weekends. And John had this idea about the Burro Flats pictograph shelter that was on that field lab property. And this is a very elaborately painted rock overhang, a lot of overpainting on it as well, mostly in black and whites and reds, and a very distinctive aperture in the overhang, the sort of the roof of the shelter, not very deep, a few feet, and that's it. And then on the back wall, all of these paintings. And some of these paintings included sets of rings. And John had the idea, and I'm just not quite sure why, that on the solstice, the sun would come up and shine through that little window of light. It wasn't really even a window, it was just sort of a gap, and would hit the three rings. Well, I thought this was all kind of wild and crazy, but nonetheless, they said, why don't you come along? Sure, I'll see what's going on. And we were out there at winter solstice, and sure enough, John is absolutely on the money. This tiny arrowhead of light first forms as the sun first appears, hits the second ring of the set, then gradually evolves into a finger of light. And although we didn't have any kind of a disciplined examination of the data or anything at that time, it sure looked like a big deal to us. So we were kind of blown away by this light and shadow effect taking place on Chumash rock art right at the boundary with what were then called the Fernandino, might be called the Tongva today, communities with mutually exclusive languages, but nonetheless were in a lot of
It's interesting that we're talking about John Romani.
Yeah.
John Romani was my closest friend, and I brought him into archaeology from surfing on the coast.
Whoa. Whoa, dude.
Whoa, dude, yes. And after my hiatus with archaeology, I went back and worked with him again. And I remember seeing on his Compass Rose website for his cultural resource management firm, I think it was a video or a series of actual photographs of what he favored to call the sun dagger.
Yeah.
And that sun dagger, in fact, intersecting with that concentric circle and the imagery within that cave. And of course, I read his master's thesis, which was rather wonderful and revelatory, and quite a number of discoveries. And it was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. It's interesting, fast forward to 2020, talking in reflection about both John Romani and Gwen Romani, who have both unfortunately passed away at this point, and their contribution to our understanding of the archaeoastronomy of California.
By your anecdote and your past history with them, as you must know, I became very close with them, maintained the friendship over the years, because it certainly didn't die at that winter solstice. John had really wild and crazy ideas about summer solstice as well. In a sense, they were completely wrong, and yet they led to another remarkable astronomical discovery that would not have occurred without the instinct that he brought to that site. And so stayed on that, obviously, for years. I had the privilege of acting in the years that followed as kind of an agent, first Rocketdyne and then Boeing. They wanted to accommodate visitors to the site, but they didn't really have a mechanism for doing it. The place is fragile in the first place, so you can never have very many people, but there were always interested people, rock art types, archaeology types, indigenous people, of course. Charlie Cook was one of the people who was involved with these very first visits there. And so over the years, I kind of had this deal with Rocketdyne where I would organize visits for people. I would collect names and kind of just make sure the whole thing was under some kind of control. And we would go in for a visit, presumably at a solstice or near that. And the other thing I was going to do was observe each of these times so that I could do what I thought was really necessary, which is look at it when it's not the solstice and find out what if this light and shadow effect is really intentionally contrived. What's it doing? What is its function? And in fact, over nearly 40 years of that kind of stuff, I think it's actually possible, in part, in a broad way, at least answer that. And just as a quickie, what I should say is that it's not an astronomical observatory. It's not a place where people are determining the solstice. They already know the answer of when the solstice is coming. They have other ways of figuring that out. Just as we were talking before about monitoring the sun on the horizon, the rock shelter is a place where there is a kind of a showing of the sacred, the sunrise at a key time of year, an absolutely profound time of year ceremonially for the Chumash. And so whatever else was going on presumably involved the people, shamans we would guess, who had access to the rock art site and made use of it for all of the other functions that their role in the community required of them. It isn't accurate enough to pin down the solstice. It works for better a 2-week period around there. So although it's accurate, it's not precise. And that came from just being able to go back again and again and look at that place under very different days off solstice. But I think maybe the most extraordinary thing to keep in mind about Burro Flats is that the case, it's always circumstantial, but the case for ancient astronomy at Burro Flats, I think, is pretty good. And yet that site is just a ridge away from the test stands where the rocket engines that brought us to the moon were operating. I think this may be the only place in the world where you see that reach for the sky from ancient times to the modern era in contact with each other. There's a lot of controversy about the field laboratory now and what will eventually come of it, but my own view is that place ought to be a national monument. The cultural resources there are extraordinary, and they extend right into the historic area, and it's spectacular habitat for animals and, of course, vegetation and open space. And my hope is, obviously, that all of that is carefully prepared and preserved for the future.
You had mentioned that John was also fixated on the issue of the summer solstice, and you alluded to the fact, a teaser, that led to some interesting discoveries. Perhaps you can illuminate us, Ed, on what you discovered with the summer solstice.
It
near
was
Borough
great.
Flats.
Yeah. John had this idea. There's a bedrock mortar at this other area away from the painted rock shell. They're not very far. It's a short walk there. So there's a bedrock mortar, and in front of there's a big boulder that's got cupules all over it. And then if you just keep going on that line, and they're not separated by, they're what, 20 feet apart at the most. And then if you keep on going, you hit the high cliff that is beyond, and in that cliff there is this deep natural cut of the highest rock. So John had the idea that this line that was kind of to the northeast, that you'd go from the bedrock mortar over the cupule rock and you'd go up to the horizon, sort of like Stonehenge or one of these other horizon observation things, with the sun coming right into that opening in the upper rock there. So he went with me then. The first time I got to go to that was the summer after the winter solstice discoveries. And as soon as I got on the ground, I thought, this makes no sense, John. The two pieces of artifact here, the bedrock mortar, the cupped boulder, they're way too close to each other. This isn't an astronomical alignment for any observation. And the horizon up there, way too close. And that sort of notch in the horizon is like this giant gap. I mean, there's no way you can use any of that to make any kind of sensible astronomical alignment. I think this is really kind of screwy. And then we just waited around for the sun to come up. and of course, the sun came up right in that gap, right there. And then it's shining down onto the area where we're standing. But a piece of it that we hadn't paid a lot of attention to was a vertical slab. There's a vertical slab of rock about 4 feet or so high. It's got a line of cupules on its top surface. The top surface is slanted. This is all natural except for the cupule line.
Right.
That slant is pointing up to this notch in the high too near cliff. And the cupule line is pointing right to the notch. And that slab then forms a shadow onto another set of bedrock mortars that's in an arrangement like a bear paw. And the tip of the shadow falls into the central mortar and bisects the one on the path coming to it. So I'm scratching my head and saying, John, this makes no sense, but Jesus, look at this. This is quite remarkable. And I'm utterly convinced as well that the solstice light and shadow effect is a reasonable element of the site too. We clearly can't prove these things from any documentation. There is no documentation to confirm that that's what folks were doing. If they were, it was kind of privileged lore. But the effects are fetching to the eye, and they interact with elements that are contrived by people. And so I think the circumstantial case is very strong. And John's instincts, once again, wrong in detail, right on the money in the big picture. So.
Wonderful. What a great way to finish up our third and final segment. Dr. Krupp, it's been an honor and a privilege to speak with you like this and to sort of go through this journey of your life and reflections on this fabulous field of archaeoastronomy. And I so appreciate your time today.
Alan, thank you, and keep up that splendid work with rock art. It is terrific.
Thank you. Well, that's it for this segment, and see you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. You can find this podcast on the educational podcast app Lyceum, Lyceum, and wherever you find podcasts. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.